It's Palm Sunday. We've been doing our Lent series, looking at the whole week of Holy Week, and today we're here celebrating actually the first day in real time of that week, Palm Sunday. But today in our message, we're actually still going to be spending some time on Thursday evening. Last week we looked at Jesus' time in the upper room. And today I want us to look at his time in the garden. But, as I was reflecting on this week, I realized that we've officially passed the 6-month mark as a church, 6 months and 2 weeks to be exact. So it's kind of crazy for me. I don't know what that feels like for you guys or what that means, but it just made me reflect some more and just think about the journey that we've taken together so far, and even just the journey through our sermons our sermon series. And I've realized we've covered a lot of ground. We've journeyed with Jesus from the desert to the promised land through the Gospel of Luke. We've gone down the mountain into the wilderness and back up again in Genesis. And now in our current series, we've been walking with Jesus and his disciples through the Passover week. And in that time, we've traveled from a city called Despair to the city of God. We've seen him worshipped as king and betrayed as slave. We've watched him eat with his friends, even those who would fall away. And today we follow him into a garden. And that made me think of the first garden in the Bible, and its name was Delight, but this one is named after an oil press, Gethsemane, a place where Jesus will be crushed like the olives of that very mountain. And so as we look at our text today, I think in that garden we see really 3 problems that all of us face and how we all tend to fail at finding the solutions on our own. And in these different people in our text, I think we can find ourselves, whether it's Adam in the first garden, Judas, Peter, an unnamed young man. I think we too often try to save ourselves, and we end up falling, faltering, failing, fleeing, whatever it is. But in Jesus alone, we're provided a way to make it through all of those things. Sometimes maybe scathed, but not broken. And so today we'll see Jesus at his, I think, lowest point, feeling utterly alone, and yet he doesn't collapse. We'll see how he overcomes both the weight of those feelings and the reality behind them. And it's my hope that by looking at Jesus, we'll see how to succeed where we otherwise would fail, and how his success opens the door for us to find hope even when things feel hopeless. But here's the thing, this story brings us back to a question that we've asked more than once here in those 6 months, and it's just this question, will we trust his ways, or will we try to take things on our own terms? This is always the question, isn't it? And so with that, just open with me again to Mark chapter 14, beginning in verse 32, and let's see what this first problem is and how Jesus responds. I'll read beginning in verse 32. It says, "And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch.' And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, 'Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but your will.' And he came and he found them sleeping, and he said, 'Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' And again he went away and he prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. In some ways beyond the narrative of the cross, I think this may actually be the saddest text of Scripture. Like leading up to this point, Jesus has always seemed so in control. Like nothing really seemed to faze him except maybe the death of his friend Lazarus. But like even then, his tears were tears of compassion and empathy more than of despair. But then here in these verses, we see Jesus for the first time feeling the full gravity of what's to come. His whole ministry, he knew this day would come. In all of eternity, he knew and willingly chose this fate, but now it's no longer in the future. It's here. It's real. It's tangible. This suffering that he was about to endure. And I was thinking about that. Like how he must feel. And like we all have loved ones. So we all know what it will be to lose them to death someday. And what that loss may look like for us. But for those of us who have actually experienced that kind of loss, we know it in a different, more real way. Like how tangible grief truly is. We know what that feels like when it's come to reality. But that isn't this for Jesus. It's actually worse and heavier than the loss of a loved one, because this is the day of his betrayal by those closest to him, leading to also tangible and real torture and mockery and his death. And so he takes his closest friends with him and to this place that we often see him run to in Scripture as a sanctuary for him, this garden where he used to feel safe and find rest. And he goes, I think, desperate to feel that one last time, but instead he feels utterly alone and abandoned. And so he begs his brothers to pray for him, and he cries out to his Father to save him from what's to come, but he knows his Father won't, and he knows his friends won't be there when he needs him most. Abandoned and alone. So Jesus in these verses 32 through 42 no longer just knows the suffering ahead, he's experiencing it in real time, and just like the olives of that place, it is crushing him to the point where his juice, his blood is coming out of his pores. The weight and the grief and the pressure of everything he's carrying is pressing down so hard that he tells his friends that just this moment feels like it could kill him. But he has to wake them up to share that. Like how disconnected must they be from his pain? How alone must he be in this moment? Recently I was catching up with a friend. Many of you may know who I'm talking about, but his son was recently diagnosed with, and by the mercy of God, is now cancer-free. But as we were talking, he was sharing just how he's surrounded now by so many people celebrating as they should, but how he still feels left in the suffering, like still processing through the grief of that experience. Just how for us from the outside, like our lives move on, but for him this is still happening. And so I and others in that moment were able to just slow down and enter into that space with him. But listen, like it would be a bad friend move if I fell asleep on him as he was sharing that moment with me. It would show how little I cared or comprehended the amount of grief that my brother was going through. And some of you can relate to that, that exact kind of moment, what my friend was talking about, where the world moves on, not recognizing the gravity of your own grief, and it's isolating. So listen to me. Like I may not understand, but Jesus does. For those of you who feel that kind of grief and isolation now, like, he's not asleep. He's present, and he mourns with you. Because Jesus understands this. Like, while his friends fell asleep on him 3 times in this text. So Jesus knows what it is to experience that grief and isolation. And so because of that, like, he stays with you in yours. So where do you go in your grief? Jesus in his loneliness goes to his brothers, but he also goes to his Father and he prays for rescue. And that's verse 35. But then in verse 36, he prays something unfathomable to him. He says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup. Yet, not what I will, but what you will. Jesus prays, God, if there's any way I don't have to go through with this, please don't make me. But if I must, I will for you. Church, real talk, have you ever prayed like that and meant it? Jesus tells his Father, I'm suffering, and I know you have the power to stop it. But I will trust you even if it's not your will to do so. Listen, if I had to put money on it, I bet many of us have said those kinds of words, but they were actually saturated in skepticism or doubt. Like, many of us have either prayed that God would heal or rescue, doubting his power to do so, or prayed in full faith that he could, but knowing that we'll trust him less if he doesn't. And in either case, we fail where Jesus succeeds. In one case, we fail to trust his power. In others, we fail to trust his goodness. But in either case, we're like Adam and Eve in the original garden, failing to trust and grasping to take control instead. And it's us taking his seat as judge over good and evil. It's claiming God in the wrong when he doesn't do our will. And like, we do that, don't we? But in verse 36, Jesus succeeds where we fail, because Jesus doesn't take the fruit for himself. He doesn't take the throne or the seat of the judge. Instead, he accepts the cup that's given to him. Where we all try to take what we think looks and tastes like life, he submits to the will of the Father even when it tastes and looks like death. Jesus enters the garden, faces the test to trust or to take, and he surrenders to the will of the Father. Jesus passes the test that we fail all the time. In our distress, we most often turn to distrust, but Jesus submits and surrenders, believing what we won't, that God makes good on his promises, which are indeed for our good, even when it looks like death or feels like suffering. But in verse 36, Jesus becomes the second and greater Adam, where the first said, my will, the second says, yours. And so that reminded me this week of Romans chapter 5, verse 19. It says, for as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, but by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous. And that's this right here. Like, the problem we all face is that when life is difficult, when we're suffering, all of us become desperate for control and we grasp for it. Or in despair, we become defiant or depressed. But where we all try to take, Jesus trusts and lets go to the Father. Where we seek control, Jesus chooses surrender. And in his despair, he turns to the Father and says, okay, your world, your will. And because of Jesus, we get to see for the first time how the surrender of one's will to God is actually the tool that transforms the world. Jesus faces the full pressure to turn away, but he chooses to trust God the Father, and that decision is everything. And this is what makes Jesus so profoundly different than everyone else, because when we face this temptation, we fail. We avoid the cup that he accepts. The cup that he accepts for us. And Jesus drinks the cup of wrath and of death so that we can drink a cup of mercy and life at his table after. So this is the first problem, is that where we take, he trusts. And then the second is that where we run, he remains. So look with me at verse 43 through 50. He says, "And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with a sword and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard.' And when he came, he went up to him and at once said, 'Rabbi,' and kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, 'Have you come out as against a robber with sword and club to capture me? Man, day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled.' And they all left him and fled." Jesus in the garden to which he would often withdraw is met by his adversaries hidden by the shadows of night. And in that darkness they attack him and they seize him. This is Jesus, the one who is known for feeding the hungry, healing the lame, giving sight to the blind. This is the one that they come to with swords and clubs. And Jesus doesn't respond back with violence, but he calls them out. Like, what do you need weapons for? Who do you think I am? And by the way, why arrest me now like this? Haven't I been easy to find, teaching in public day after day? But we know, and he knows why this is the way they came, Matthew 21:46. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowd because they held him as a prophet. They're here like this in fear. Or John 12:42 says, "Nevertheless many, even the authorities, believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees they did not confess, so that they would not be put out of the synagogues." These people were afraid of the crowd, that the crowd would stop them because Jesus had displayed true power, and so they were afraid to lose theirs. Remember earlier that week the crowd of people who ushered Jesus into the city on Palm Sunday, which we remember today. And remember how Jesus shamed the leaders for how they allowed the temple to become what it had. And so these leaders were afraid to lose their power and influence. And so in their fear, it led them to violence. They were afraid of what would happen if they repented, so instead they rallied and rebelled. Judas was afraid that Jesus may not be able to do what he had promised, so he betrayed instead of believed. Jesus' disciples couldn't believe that Jesus could actually die, as he said, so they lived in denial to the point where they could fall asleep instead of enter into his despair. And all of us, we fall into one of these categories too. In any case, the conclusion is that we're running away from God's reality instead of remaining in it in faith. When things are hard, our first instinct is either to fight, to falter, to fail, to flee. And here's what I mean by those things. Some of us right now are in the midst of real struggles. Some financial, some within our families, our homes. And so in one case, instead of surrendering to the reality that something needs to change, we're holding on for dear life to whatever control we think we have. Maybe you're self-employed or you're a manager, and part of that's because you just like to be your own boss. But you're realizing you might need to find an employer. But pride's preventing you from submitting to that. Maybe it's time to look for a new job or career, but you don't want to lose control of your schedule or independence, and it feels like failure when actually maybe that's the means of God's provision waiting for you. I'm processing through that kind of stuff with my own business. Or maybe it's not a self-employment thing. Maybe it's just that the occupation that you have is just taking too much time from home. Maybe it's not job related at all. Whatever it is, maybe you're here and realizing that you're fighting to keep something that God's asking you to surrender. Maybe it's something hard in life right now and you aren't fighting it, but instead you're just rolling over and allowing those circumstances to beat you down. And it's making you unsteady and not yourself. And your character's faltering. You're making decisions you didn't think you were capable of. You find yourself constantly mistreating your family and friends because of the stress and the fear. And so you're lashing out. Maybe you're not selling them as slaves, but you're talking to them or treating them like they don't matter. Because that's what sin does. It distorts our views of others, and it devalues people that God made in his image. And we just keep taking from people instead of serving them, and we keep justifying it, telling ourselves that we're owed something by the world, and we keep putting ourselves first, whether it's the way that we treat people or it's self-pity, and we're pretending that it's okay because we need to protect ourselves or that there's no one who could understand. Or maybe it's not that you're fighting or faltering, maybe it's just that you're fleeing, like you're running away. Something in your life needs attention, a hard conversation, a relationship that needs healing, a role that you need to step into or out of, but you're finding every excuse to avoid it. Maybe God's calling you to step up somewhere or to step down, but you're telling yourself that if you ignore it, it will just resolve itself. And I don't know if that's ever worked out for anybody. In my experience, it just only gets worse. But in all of this, Jesus knows what it looks like to struggle and to face injustice and to literally have the world against him despite his complete innocence and authority. And yet when attacked, he doesn't fight, he doesn't falter, he doesn't flee. Instead, he turns to the Father and he's honest about the struggle he's having, but he stands firmly rooted in the will of the Father despite, faithful to remain there, trusting that God the Father will not rescue him from suffering, but will lead him through. Psalm 16, listen to this. I don't know if this was part of Jesus' prayer, but the Spirit just really led me here while I was writing this message. And so I'm going to read the whole psalm to you. It's only 11 verses. But I want you to just meditate on this as I read it over us this morning. Close your eyes if you have to. But this is Psalm 16. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrow of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out or take their names on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices, and my flesh also dwells secure. For I will not be abandoned. He will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So I don't know if Jesus prayed the psalm that night in the garden, if it came to mind at all. He probably didn't. But he lived out the truth of this psalm. That despite the suffering of that moment, he remained with the Father, because that's where he found refuge. And despite all the places we may run, we'll find no good apart from him. Only sorrow, as the psalm says. And so Jesus knows this. And so he chooses the cup. Even when it looks like wrath, he takes on death because he knows that God holds his fate and is for him and promises that he won't abandon him to death, but actually he's leading him through to life and joy in his presence forevermore, as verse 11 says. It's like for us, like when life was at its absolute lowest, we can look to the way that Jesus responded to that. How he felt alone and abandoned, and he didn't fight to hold on to the life that he had or his position amongst the people there. He didn't falter in who he was like Judas, and he didn't live in denial either, and he didn't run away in fear like verse 50 says that his closest friends did. Instead, Jesus accepts the cup that everybody else runs from. You know, something else here as we consider this cup that Jesus drank is like, he's a king. And most kings had cup bearers who would drink first and die for the king if the cup was poisoned. But Jesus is the only king who doesn't pass the cup to others, but drinks first to save us from the wrath. Jesus doesn't run from suffering. He doesn't fight, falter, flee. Instead, he remains and faces it for us. He drinks the cup of wrath and death so that we can drink that cup of mercy and life. And so that's the mystery of Maundy Thursday, that the cup offered to him was judgment, but the cup offered to us is grace. And I think this courage we find in Jesus is profound and compelling, that in this text we see the severity of his agony and anxiety, and yet we find him standing firm. Not running, not rebelling against the Father, but surrendering to it, and it reveals the true strength of his character in ways that only suffering can reveal. Like who someone is in suffering shows us who they truly are, you know? Like simple test, stub your toe and see what words come out. But watch someone lose their job or get diagnosed with something life-threatening. How they respond reveals who they really are. Whether they try to fight, whether they fight everyone around them, whether they falter into that depression or bitterness, if they flee into denial, like suffering will make all of that come out. And the same's true for us just as it was for Jesus, because how we suffer reveals who we are and where we've placed our trust and our hope and our affections. And in Jesus we see the only one who never fought, faltered, or fled. He never ran, he remained, and he drank the cup we couldn't. And in this suffering it exposes the truth of his humanity. This moment of anxiety and fear in the garden is what allows us to see his courage and his faith in ways that we can actually relate to and aspire to. Because up until now, so much of his story, like it's tempting to say, yeah, but he's God. In so many of the accounts of Jesus, it's just to fall on that excuse and to relieve ourselves from any responsibility in how we're called to his model. But here, there's no room for that. Like here, the cardboard Jesus just falls apart and it crumbles under his own tears, sweat, and blood. It like disintegrates this cutout, and we're left with this messy human experience of Jesus. So what I'm suggesting is that he's never been more relatable to us than here in the garden, while at the same moment remaining profoundly different and above in how he handles and responds. See, again, his suffering exposes him the same way that ours does, but in this moment of ultimate vulnerability, we find not someone of sin or shame, but of true strength and faith and submission to the Father. And that comes in stark contrast to the one revealed in our last two verses. So read with me verse 51 through 52. It says, "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." So a young man, one of the 12, runs away instead of remaining with Jesus in this moment of stress. And in it, he's exposed, left literally naked. And This unnamed disciple just so clearly takes our minds back to the first garden where, again, this running from God happens in Adam and Eve and their sin. And for the first time, their nakedness is exposed to them and they experience shame for the first time. And then in their guilt, instead of running to the Father, they run and they hide. Church, how many of us do the same? When we fall into sin, we distance and hide instead of drawing close. Like men in the room, I'm going to generalize for a moment, but some of you understand this experience. You've typed something into your browser you shouldn't, and afterwards, instead of turning to the Father for forgiveness, you internally withdraw and you condemn yourself. Women, how many of you find yourselves comparing your lives to others, either hating what you see, envious for others, or being tempted to look down on others because of your life versus their life, your mirror versus their mirror? In either case, when you catch yourself in that mindset, you internalize that and you allow the lies to define who you are instead of the Father. Man, like I could list so many examples of experiences, so I don't mean to generalize or assume with those two illustrations, but I chose them because of just how common they are. But what's universal between them both and goes beyond the gender to the reality of our shared condition is that too often when we're faced with the reality of our own shortcomings, like we run. We distance ourselves from God and his family instead of drawing in where we can receive forgiveness and grace. So let me just remind you again how God responds to our brokenness, especially when we're repentant. In Genesis chapter 3, 21 through 22, God calls out and pursues Adam and Eve right after their failure, right after they run and hide. And then he makes a sacrifice to clothe their nakedness. God makes a sacrifice and a way to cover over and remove their shame. You know, I was like looking into this guy in verses 51 through 52, and I found like a lot of people, church fathers even, like they read this and they believe it's Mark himself, the young man in the garden. Like Clement, Jerome, Augustine, even Calvin, all wrote about this and believed that Mark is the one who gives us these details about himself because it emphasizes the reality that we all do this. We all run when we should remain, except Jesus. And more, Jesus doesn't respond by sacrificing an animal, but by sacrificing himself. And he doesn't clothe us with garments of animal skin, but he clothes us in his righteousness, embodied by his broken body and shed blood for us. And so that's why at the supper, just hours before this moment, he invites, instructs, and pleads with his disciples to abide in him. Because he knew they would run away. He told them as much. We talked about that last week. It's prophesied. And so in light of that, he tells them what he always has. Things like Matthew 11, 28 through 30, like, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke and learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy, my burden is light." Or that abiding, John 15, 9 through 11, "As the Father has loved me, so I've loved you. Abide in my love. These things I've spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full." So listen, when we fall away, falter, fail, flee, whatever, don't keep running away. Turn back to him. That's what repentance means. So listen, as we consider this garden moment and compare it to the first, in both the human condition is exposed. When presented with temptation, with suffering, with a choice to trust or take, none of us pass the test of the garden except for Jesus. When we fall, falter, fail, flee, Jesus submits and surrenders and remains in the will of the Father, trusting him to remember his children in their suffering and to be their resting place for their good. And because Jesus passes the test, the prophecies of old can be fulfilled. And And like Isaiah then can say with full confidence, 61 through 10, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself like a priest with a beautiful headdress, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. We can rejoice in the Lord because when we fall short, he sacrifices himself to clothe us in his righteousness. So much so that Galatians 3:27, for as many of you were baptized into Christ, we get to put on Christ. So listen, here's the deal. We all fail the garden test. Whether by control, avoidance, shame, every one of us chooses self over surrender, power over obedience, hiding over honesty. Like Adam, Judas, Peter, the young man, we all try to save ourselves and we end up failing. But Jesus passes the test for us. In the place where we grasp and take, he surrenders and trusts. Where we run, he remains. Where we're exposed to shame, he sacrifices and clothes. He drinks the cup we couldn't bear, and in doing so opens the way back to the Father, the family, and the feast. So the question for us isn't have we failed, it's will we return. This morning, would we recognize the ways that we've run from Jesus and repent so that we can return to him and receive this cup of mercy and rest? He drank the cup of judgment, and in so doing opens the way back for us into mercy and grace with the Father in the family at the feast. So my invitation for all of us this morning is to stop running away and instead enter in and find rest. Let's pray.